Hello, my name is Blair Clemo. I'm the ceramics area head in the Department of Craft and Material Studies at Virginia Commonwealth University. I'm an Artaxis member, and I'm calling my talk today Mediating Industry and the Hand. So I think it's important to start by saying that all ceramic artists interface with industry in some way, whether it's examined critically in the work or not. We have access to these quality assured materials that are really based on industrial need for those materials. We use things like computerized kilns, which have allowed industry to make cheap and efficient products. Even just the act of making pots in my studio points a critical finger at industry. I make pots and industry makes pots, but we do those things in radically different ways. The outcomes do different things and end up in different cultural places and ask different cultural questions. So just me sitting in the studio making pots is directly subversive to industry and challenges the output of objects that are available in the world, most of which are made by industry, not by hand. So today I'm going to talk about mediating industry and hand making through the lens of two distinct bodies of work, both of which were made at international residency programs several years apart. But both attempt to make tangible this tension that I feel between industry and hand making, and it's something that's constantly an undercurrent in my work. The first body of work I'll share with you I made during the summer of 2012 at a residency at the Center for Ceramics in Berlin, Germany. So one of the primary reasons I wanted to go to Germany was because I really wanted to visit the Meissen Porcelain manufactory outside of Dresden. And when I did, I went on this little tour and watched a factory worker make this cup. And this worker was using a hand-making press molding process, which is exactly what I've been doing in the studio for about 10 years. I hand make objects by press molding them. So I really walked away from this tour thinking Meissen's using a handmade press molding system. I'm using a hand-making press mold system. What's really the difference between us? And that became sort of the hinge point for me to ask a more conceptual and deeper question about that and ask how I can address that in my work through visual terms. So I started to ask that question in the studio by first coming back and making a clay replica of a Meissen form, and then making a mold of that form. And then I could start to ask that question in material terms and ask how this material can start to create a record of that question. So I think that question of the difference between myself and Meissen plays out best in this work through just one distinct kind of touch. And that's that heavy interior fingerprint that you can see on the cup on the right. From just looking at the outside of these objects, and especially looking at them as a group, they're obviously serially produced. They have the mark of the mold that makes the same object every time. But looking at them from the interior, they bear a very individual mark, and that's the mark of my fingerprint, which is different than anybody else's fingerprint on the planet. So there's literally a different kind of making on the outside, which is a mold making process, and the inside, which resembles a pinch pot. So these objects have a built-in tension between these two kinds of making. So the next project I'd like to talk about was made during the summer of 2016 in Jindo, China. So this was my first time working in Jindo, and I was immediately struck at how the remnants and the refuse of industry was recontextualized throughout the city. Here on the left, a gap in a structure has been filled in with old molds. Here on the right, a cobblestone wall built out of post-industrial molds. So it was this kind of recontextualization and this essentially collaging of these pieces coming together that really started to give me some questions in the studio to pursue. So there's spaces like this all over the city where an industry in decline shut its doors and walked away and allowed this entropy and degradation. So spaces like this and seeing those big piles of molds like the image on the right really made me ask a lot of questions about how these molds can enter an art space and start to add to a different kind of dialogue than all the commercial products that they've been used to make for years and years and years. So I started to collect some of these molds, bring them back to the studio, and press out pieces to make these collage together vessels. The piece on the left figuratively flips industry on its head through this sort of dynamic, artistic, and individual gesture. Also in those press molded collages, I'm slip casting these concentric circles. I think a lot about the concentric circle as a kind of a fingerprint. It's really just my hand tracing the motion of the wheel being a tool used for hand making, and that concentric circle really being the mark of the wheel in my mind. So this is a way of directly asserting and inserting on that surface a handmade gesture, a wheel-thrown gesture. So here's some more recent work, but from that same body of work. And for me, this really becomes work about process and talking about the difference between that industrial process and a hand-making process. Exactly half of these objects are made with a mold, and they are conspicuously made with a mold. There's still fetals and flashing and that heavy finger pressing on the inside. The other half gets that spiral, which can only be achieved by wheel throwing. So they're two distinctly different processes coming together to make one object. Thank you so much for watching and supporting Artaxis and National Clay Week.